Hello and welcome, I'm Marina Kim with the latest updates from Kazakhstan. Representatives of the country's democratic community took part in the meeting next to the memorial slab to the victims of the Great Famine of the 30s. Activists see the reflection of the past repressions in the contemporary reality of Kazakhstan.
My name is Gulnar Ahmediyeva and I'm a deputy prosecutor of this area. Now listen carefully. You should stop your actions as this demonstration was dedicated to a completely different thing. Your actions are illegal. No parallels between past and present should be drawn. This is the main complaint made to members of the unregistered party Alga who paid tribute to the victims of political repressions. Activists believe that prisoners of conscience are not only representatives of intelligentsia executed back in 1930s, but also contemporaries not liked by the current authorities.
Do we really need this OSCE-chairing pseudo-democracy built by Nazarbayev?
Later, activists of the movement Kazakhstan 86 also joined members of Alga to honor the memory of the innocents killed in 1986. The main demand was to restore the historical justice. No one can take possessions to the afterlife, so the authorities should just give their excesses to the people, and in response they will be praised until the end of the days. At that moment, the action participants recalled their own missions, religious for representatives of the movement Atan led by Amantai Kaji, and historical for the party Alga. The people who joined us later apparently forgot the theme of the rally and everything got mixed up. The policemen, however, were not satisfied with this explanation, and the rally organizers had to stop their actions in order not to join the ranks of already politically convicted prisoners.
More than 100 people from across the entire country were gathered together in Karaganda by the political bloc Narodovlastia, the People Rule, to commemorate the victims of political repressions. Although the organizers had no permission to hold the rally, the action proceeded to the end without incidents. Another march of dissent was held in Astana, while members of youth movements displayed examples of contemporary repressions in local colonies.
Public defender Talas Agimbayev and his clients marched from the main mosque of the capital, Nur Astana, to the headquarters of the ruling party, Nur Otan. The march was peaceful and none of the participants even had a single poster. This likely was the reason the action did not end with a traditional arrest. The march lasted 10 minutes, and at the party's office the participants explained that their action was timed to mark the day of political repression's victims. Some events in modern Kazakhstan are similar to those in the Stalin's time, as ordinary citizens are being subjected to arrest and suffering from officials' deeds.
You condemn them for starvation. Does this not remind you of the events of the 1930s? They no longer can provide for their families.
At the same time, in another district of Astana, youth activists are watching the footage of a prisoner being beaten in the colony Dalinka, a former branch of the infamous Karlak. It is symbolical that the incident occurred now, say the activists, noting that political prisoners still exist in Kazakhstan, although the state does not recognize them officially.
People in Kazakhstan are being tortured and imprisoned for fake charges. Unlike now, during Stalin's time, the authorities at least acknowledged that the prosecution was for illegal political dissent.
Meanwhile, the picketers near Nur Otan insisted that Kazakh citizens are being prosecuted by the members of the ruling party, those officials and MPs who secretly own business. In response, party members rejected the statement and accused the protesters of self-promotion.
Just over 2 years, from 1937 to 1938, more than 100,000 people were arrested in Kazakhstan, with every forced detention ending up with execution. For decades, people tried avoiding this topic, and the tragedy largely remained in the memory of those affected directly or members of victims' families.
Clara Kulenova's mother, Uazepa, was arrested mere 2 weeks after the execution of her husband, because back then the NKVD persecuted entire families of political prisoners. All women, wives, sisters and mothers were brought to special camps. One of them, the infamous Algier, was located in the village of Malinovka, and its peak housed up to 20,000 people, a dubious record for Soviet women camps. This is where Uazepa Kulenova ended up after spending time in several prisons in the Karlak. My mother told me that the scariest moment was when children were separated from their mothers before the execution. Everyone was brought to a special place, and there were a lot of screaming and crying there. Clara was only 3.5 years old when she was left alone. Somehow her relatives managed to convince the authorities to leave them the custody and not send the child to an orphanage. Next time she saw her mother was only 8 years later, after Azapa managed to survive the camp only because people there kept together. Mother told me that everyone took care of each other. Those who could read helped their illiterate friends to read mail, but tried to conceal bad news, like in the case of one woman whose son died in the war. In total, almost 40 million Soviet citizens were convicted for the so-called counter-revolutionary crimes from 1921 to 1953. About 700,000 people were executed. In Kazakhstan, over 100,000 people became victims of political repressions. According to historians, these figures are most likely understated, as Soviet camps Gulag, Karlak, Steplak, Alger and the others held up to the 2 million prisoners from all over the USSR. Most of those who died in Almaty were executed and buried in mass graves near the village of Zhonnalik. Victims of political repressions and their families all share similar stories. Fabricated cases against breadwinners led to the demise of the other family members. A well-known writer and public figure, Sakyen Seyfulin, was arrested and then executed in 1938 for being a bourgeois nationalist. His niece Rimzhan remembers the arrest. 2 people entered our house and showed us the arrest documents. My uncle turned white and asked for a glass of water, but they said no. So he went to pack his things while one officer followed him and the other searched his room. The archives of the Kazakh People's Commissariat of the Internal Affairs are still classified. The public activist attempts to learn the truth are ignored by the authorities. Apparently, they still have something to hide.
Meanwhile, a contemporary political prisoner, Yermek Narymbayev, is still in jail for already a month, continuing his hunger strike. On May 1st, the chairman of the mortgage committee, Arman, joined his colleagues who organized a hunger strike next to the office of the party Alga in Almaty. Later, the public activist was arrested but refuses to stop the hunger strike and give up his demands.
Yermek Narymbayev was taken into custody for taking part in the unsanctioned rally on May 1st, when the democratic community was not allowed to march through the streets of Almaty. In response, opposition members declared a hunger strike. Later, in addition to the alleged participation in the rally, Narymbayev was charged with the resistance to internal affairs officers, as well as contempt of court. Now he faces up to 5 years imprisonment. According to Narymbayev's spouse, the activist was transferred from the city isolation ward to the regional detention center with no legal basis. Even while imprisoned, Narymbayev refuses to end his hunger strike. Today is the 31st day of my husband's hunger strike. At the same time, he is held in a solitary cell, denied visits for almost a month, and the guards never called him an ambulance.
Back to historic topics. The exact location of Alikhan Bukhanov's grave is still a debatable issue. Just recently, the grandson of the famous repressed politician found a registration list of those buried after the execution in 1937.
The remains of Alikhan Bukhanov were buried in Moscow Donskoy cemetery. This new fact in the biography of the political prisoner was made known by his grandson Yevgeny Bukhanov. Until now, it was widely believed that the prominent Kazakh leader of the 20s was buried in a mass grave in Butovo.
We went there several times, but we rejected the exhumation. The place is the former summer residence of Yagoda, where many prisoners were executed and buried. We thought that our grandfather was also there.
The politician's grandson learned only recently that Bukhanov might be buried near the walls of the Donskoy monastery. Luckily, his name was listed as one of the peoples buried there. Alikhan Bukhanov was one of the very politically active leaders of Alashorda. He was a member of the First State Senate and later became the commissar of the interim government of Kazakhstan, as well as the prime minister of the Alash autonomy. The creation of this autonomy was an attempt of the national intelligentsia led by Bukhanov to separate from Bolshevik Russia and to prevent the spread of Bolshevism in Kazakhstan. Bukhanov was executed on September 27, 1937. Some sources say that he was accused of spying for Japan, others for being a member of a terrorist organization. Only in 1989, Bukhanov was rehabilitated and recognized a patriot and a fighter for the independence of Kazakhstan. Interestingly, the remains of another public figure, Nigmet Nurmakov, are also buried in the same mass grave with the remains of the politician.